This is Chad Briggs. I'm from the University of Alaska in Anchorage, and I'm very happy to be joined by my friend and colleague, Natalia Wojtowicz, in the Netherlands. So Natalia, could you please introduce yourself briefly?
I would love to. Good evening from Delft, from the Netherlands. I am currently a lecturer at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, where I specialize in wargaming. And before accepting that appointment for the last 5 years, I was leading the project on wargaming modeling and simulation in the NATO Civil Military Cooperation Center of Excellence. So I would like to share a bit of my experience, and let's have a chat about wargames.
Okay. So for people who really aren't familiar with the concept, why do we carry out war games? Why are they either analytically important for strategists, or why are they important for training?
Well, I think that those are two purposes that show how to use war games. Why are they good for some questions and problems? And when I started my work in training and education, all the courses looked similar, which means there was quite a lot of theory by PowerPoint and small exercises at the end of the course. And I started to look at the retention rate. So how much would you remember from that course in a day, in a week, in 6 months? And I have to say lectures are not the most effective way of implementing knowledge. I usually compare it to a bike. So if you tell me about riding a bike, so you have to sit on it, you have to start wiggling your legs in circles. Okay, that tells me something. But if you let me ride that bike, I will probably remember it, as the saying goes, for the rest of your life. So you do not forget how to ride a bike. And the principle of wargaming is the same. So if you use it for training, the retention rate was much higher, as well as engagement, because you are doing instead of receiving the knowledge. And it also has different application when it comes to an organization and to an individual. So when we speak about organization, this really shows whether the organization can learn or not. So simply speaking, if we look at the new concepts that are turning up on the political level, did you test them? Do you know what they mean in practice? And we had that example with resilience that was endorsed in 2016 for NATO, but different headquarters had different interpretations, different practice on it. And simply we needed to bring it back to reality. How does that concept serve the purpose? And to do that, we used the wargame that translated the points from the policy to the reality of the countries that NATO was working for. So in the end, for an organization, that can be quite a challenger or a collector of data, and it has to be used wisely. And for an individual, that can translate into competence. And I was quite fascinated by this distinction. So I was watching officers or civilians that were playing a war game, and I was asking, what makes them good? What makes a success both in an organization and in the war game? And we did separate evaluations. We had a mega game of 100 persons in an exercise, and we had 3 evaluators that came from different backgrounds, so you would avoid the bias. Different genders, different professional interests. So you would maybe suspect they were looking for different things when they observe a performance. But the conclusion was, no, the competence is quite universal, and all of them pointed to the same individuals during the assessment. So that made me think, during wargaming, you can also recognize what would be the best function for separate groups. And it does not mean that you are automatically assigning value to these individuals, because what I also found out is there is a value in different attitudes or skills. The only trap is that you do not get the wrong one at the wrong time. So you want to have this information ahead of the actual problem that happens. So you know that this group is very initiative based, or the other way around, they are very focused on their limited tasks. So if you get this group in terms of a new problem, unknown situation, high uncertainty, you want to have the initiative based guys.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what I have found out when we were looking into alternative scenarios for attacks on NATO. So if you have a group of individuals during their training that say, oh, that will never happen, or that is not my mandate, then you have to look into, all right, but what is the solution in this case? And if they do not have an answer how to solve it otherwise, then this can be troublesome.
Well, and I think it's a little misleading for some people who are used to kind of board games where the point is to win. And to describe to people that, no, in the war games and simulations that we do, you don't have to win in order to learn things. When you and I met, this was in Kiev, and I was hosting a war game about further Russian incursion into Ukraine. And I admit there was no good outcome to that scenario, but it could still be useful to see, where the vulnerabilities were or how people would react. So could you give examples of where people have come up with new strategic insight from even when things go wrong? Not that there was a right or wrong answer to the scenarios, but where NATO might have learned something.
Well, I have to say that I often come back to the first war game that I designed back in 2017. And that war game was based on the scenario of deterrence. So what we have actually now on the eastern flank. And the question, first of all, was how do you play out deterrence? Because we are quite good in the kinetic assessment of how many units or weapons are on each side and how to raise readiness so this weapon move faster. But if we are challenged by a different action, then it starts to be quite overwhelming. So I divided the group into 4 actors, and I wanted to see not only the red, the enemy, and the blue, the friendly forces, but I also introduced international organizations, humanitarians, NGOs, and we also had the local population, so they play a role in the security of their own countries. And that came back to the doctrine of the Cold War, because the solutions that are very often proposed now for the security come from that time. So we have more exercises, more readiness, maybe higher number of stationed forces. But again, if the threat is not conventional, then we have to look into how would you respond to that. And I left this initiative to our participants, so they could actually propose a course of action that supports a mission of getting more influence or destabilizing the area. And then you see a very high creativity about solving such problems, because obviously this environment is artificial. So you are not paying for your mistakes or bad assumptions with either the proverbial blood or gold. You are just paying with minus or plus points. And I agree with you. It is a real threat that you will get players with the game mode. So they do not look at the actual value of this exercise, but they simply want to be the winner. And the answer to that is we have to look that the actions they would propose would be realistic. So they cannot say, I am, for example, assassinating the head of state or assassinating the 4-star general.
Mm-hmm.
No, if you are playing on tactical level, what would have an actual impact in terms of your mission? So there has to be a reality check, and that is the only possible counteraction to the gamer mode. And there was a study about it. In simple terms, in a tactical simulator, if you would have the mission to capture the flag, and on the way you have a number of incidents. So let's say indeed civilians on the road, or there is a gas that is leaking, things like that. Do you stop to fix it, or do you just race through to the flag? And there is the majority of the players that race for the flag. So you really have to account for it as the facilitator, that you reiterate every time our focus is. And the other part which you can do when you are designing is of course scoring. So if you would say instead of your goal is capturing the flag, your goal is to solve as many incidents as possible on the way to the flag, then you would get a much different outcomes and also experience for the participants. So I would say there is a high responsibility for the designers to account for this, things that can influence on one side what happens, on the other side there is also a danger that you take the design you made for a result. Mm-hmm. So once I took part in a what was called a simulation of dividing humanitarian aid to different cities. And one of the rules that was introduced was that you could only speak for 1 minute with 3 other players to deconflict your actions. And at the end of this simulation, as they proclaimed, they said, there is a communication problem. And I said, no, that is the rule that you have introduced to us. We do not have that problem by ourselves. And quite frankly, we could solve it by round 3 by saying, okay, you send medicine to the north and I will send food to the east. So also this could be counteracted. So in the end, there's a lot of possible mistakes to be made. And if you are looking at security, I was thinking about the positive and negative side of it. And I would say positive is very rarely played out, or I don't know many examples. So what I mean with that is a negative goal would be to destroy your enemy or claim this territory as yours. Whereas positive goal would be to defend the territory or bring back the peace or increase stability. And that part is also more reflective of the full spectrum of tasks that are now undertaken by all security services. So it is a long story indeed. I was speaking very long, so please.
No, it's fine. I mean, it's interesting to hear your experiences. Yeah, sometimes we have this problem of, you can make a scenario realistic, but sometimes they can almost be too realistic and people get bogged down in details. And then even if they try to work on, well, this is how an organization would work, they get caught in all the standard operating procedures or assumptions. And it's why, as you know, I often create fictional countries to place the war games, because then it's much easier for the designer to focus and say, these are the concepts and the incidents that we focus on. Although, as my former participants know, I also throw in real world events at the same time, keep them on their toes. But you've talked about your experiences. You have a new book coming out now.
Right, I can flash it. I think, I don't know if that shows.
Yes.
So it is just Wargaming Experiences as the title, and it does present the last 10 war games I made and what I learned doing them. because there was quite an intense period of experimentation that led to the final outcome. And I also wanted to share how it is established, because in a way, I have the feeling about wargaming that as a discipline, it is dominated by practice. So we don't have a lot of shared books, theories, even definitions. That is still a point of contention. So if somebody is entering this discipline, I think that can be quite confusing. And on the bright note, when I wrote this book, I thought I would like to read it before I start it. That would save me so much of the possible turnarounds, because I was looking at all possible angles and experimenting with, I called it the unnatural selection. So I would simply take 1, 2, 3 war games and pit them against each other. So I would say which one is performing better. And that led to conclusions about what you have mentioned. Is reality-based scenario better, or do you need artificial country? Is historical scenario better, or it makes sense to base it on open source information? Is, for example, digital computer-based simulation more effective than the facilitated one? I looked as well on, let's say, the personal facilitator. So I would take a war game and give it to other people and ask them to do it and look at the rankings. So I would say, okay, is the war game strong, or was the presentation so good? And in the end, there is a number of experiences that I share about these conclusions, which I think could be very good as an introduction, but it takes you, let's say, each chapter is more advanced. So it follows me when I was designing the first war game, what kind of presentations, for example, I had to produce to convince my superiors to let me play it. And how it developed over time from having nothing, because wargame is kind of a black horse. Everybody heard about it, but nobody knows what it actually means, towards an established program that was in every training solution that CCOE had. So it became a norm from an incident. And I thought that this could be something that other people take forward.
Yeah, it's wonderful that you've sort of cataloged and documented your experiences, because, as you say, it's often based on practice, and many of the books out there are histories that, I mean, you can learn endless things about the original Kriegspiel, or about War Plan Orange in the US in the early 1900s, but the more innovative uses, which I think, you know, we're trying to experiment with now. Yeah, you're right. It's difficult to be a trendsetter, because then you have to write the first book on things, and you can't just reference.
Well, I wanted to do the same as you. I wanted to start a conversation. So the first chapters, they simply state the dilemmas that wargamers or people outside of the discipline are posing, such as structured versus more open-ended wargames, or collection of data and validity in scientific world, the reproduction of results and the participants' dependency. And I will not say that I have a fixed answer to these questions. I would say that I have collected different voices that were trying to address this question, because at one point I found myself responding to them over time. So my answer was being more informed, more advanced, and I thought, maybe if I open this question as well, these dilemmas, to the public, then I would get more of insights on basically wargaming discipline as a whole, and that touched upon practice as well as science, as well as hobby players that bring forward the most fantastic insights. So I very often playtest with hobby gamers, because their archive of existing mechanics or scenarios is endless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was really my start in the civilian hobby world, and then went from there into the more military wargaming. And it's funny how accepting people are of that background. You know, when people would ask, well, so how did you get to work with war games in the military? It's, oh, I used to write for Chaosium, you know, write about King Arthur. And they're like, oh, that's great, that's great.
Well,
And
it is a skill, and I completely agree. So at the time that I started designing games for NATO, I also did a survey of our population of participants that would come forward to the wargaming. And I looked at, let's say, level of acceptance towards different solutions. So how many of them currently play a board game, play a digital game, play a kind of social game, play role-playing games, and I looked at the percentage to see which solution would make the most sense. And I think that is really important for all the designers or students, that when they are designing, they should already think directly in terms of who is playing your war game. So if you have a specific focus on Alaska security or on environment, who would be the people on the table and what would be their focus? And in terms of method as well, let's say how complex your solution can be. Because what I found over time is actually we started quite complex with databases and with models, but we noticed that people really preferred the not simple, but games that you can explain in 5 minutes. So they would like to know what happens each round and what is their actions and who is winning. So if you have a big model behind it, most of the time it would be hidden. And we would gravitate towards more realistic and meaningful scenarios with simpler mechanics.
yeah, the simplification is important. Like I said, people can easily get bogged down in details, and then they lose the essence of what they're trying to accomplish or learn. And yeah, it's something I'm trying to avoid. So the war games this summer, if I do one in Alaska, how do you deal with all the current politics, the COVID, the social unrest? It's really hard to then actually deal with the events that we're trying to represent, and it's really hard to. I mean, we've modeled pandemics before in war games, but when you throw yourself right in the middle of an existing one, then it really distracts people from their focus.
Yeah, we had the same question when we were choosing the scenarios, and then indeed that is what I would call a relation between the participants, the designer, and the reality. So if you would say we do have a reality that is at the moment really challenging, so it is affecting each of the participants. And then the question is whether the purpose of the war game is to escape it or to face it. And if we speak about pandemic or even more catastrophic scenarios, I just found that it has to be grounded with real life examples, and it has to be deeply respectful of what has happened. So we did tackle, let's say, the worst of current cases, including the Mosul battle. That was a scenario where basically the rules of law or any conventions were burned down by the opposing side. So you would have literally human shields in the city center, and you would have tactics that led to the concealment of the fighters and the civilians. So there was a very high margin of possible mistake. And the question is, if we are introducing such scenario that is affecting everybody to the core, then the question is why? Why are you showing me this picture? And the answer that we had was, that is because urban battle is not only limited to this catastrophic scenario, it is something that possibly you as a soldier or as a civilian analyst will have to approach as well. And then if you know the dilemmas that are existing about identification, about evacuation, about medical services, about headquarters that are in civilian buildings, you will know how to position yourself. You will know what kind of data answers are produced. And General Mattis said that for him, reading is like building an intellectual garden. So you are sowing the seeds of different problems and you can watch them grow. Because it is not the purpose to make the participants of a war game mindlessly looking at brutality. It is the purpose for them to see what kind of lessons can be applied in the future in reality to those situations. And I will be the first one to admit a lot of these dilemmas do not have a solution. The only thing that can happen is that you are familiarized in advance with such a problem and you are able to start thinking about it. What would I do? What is the best path forward? What is the best way out of it? And then start socializing the solutions. Because that can also be that the individual does not possess at the moment the answer, but as a group they are able to produce some sorts of way out, and that of course makes for a very valuable experience. So from my side, there always has to be a balance between your purpose and the force, the strength of your scenario. I was once in a kind of serious game that was devised for flood and the rescue services. And they had a computer algorithm that generated adverse circumstances. And we were playing out that we are the evacuation team in the middle of a river. And the algorithm generated that we have to make a shelter there. So I asked, what is the reason to have this combination? And to this day, I cannot answer that question. The designer said it's just a random system, but I would say it makes sense to connect the circumstance with some sorts of logic. So I would say, yes, shelter makes sense if you are on the ground. And the same for your designing. So every time ask yourself what is happening here and what is the value of it to the participant. So you are not lost in a monologue, you are more in a conversation, and very often that comes out when you play test it. And I always tried to bring forward people that participated in the events on the ground, if that is a realistic scenario, because they just can crush your model of perception and they can tell you, well, that's not actually how it happened, or there was nothing I could do about it. And then you can go deeper, okay, why? And you have much higher credibility of the results when you say this is based on an interview with the actual participants of the events. So on one side, respect, on the other side, purpose. On the last leg, you still need to try to uphold the truth about the situation. And that might be quite a handful to juggle, yes.
It is. And it does point out the importance of the designer and the referee that, yeah, randomness it's important because it does happen. And you can't just have a predetermined storyline, but it has to be plausible. It has to fit with experiences on the ground so that people don't sit and push back and go, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Why that would happen or why we would have to do that. Yeah.
I would say so. Or even more dangerously, you could install in people false conceptions based on your wargame. So if you would say the biggest threat when you go to Africa is malaria, but depending on the region that you are going to, there will be very different conditions and very different considerations. So if you would train people this one angle and they land on the ground and they are seeing much different reality, I think this is the worst possible outcome for both sides. So you have to be quite careful that it is not somehow a projection of your assumptions, that it is indeed calibrated to reality, to scientific side, to the truth of the events. And again, it has to be not one-sided, but multi-perspective. That's why I really like to play with multiple players, but that also makes it quite complicated to center it to an outcome.
Yeah. Well, I think that encapsulates a lot of the lessons that we need to go on. And so I want to thank you for the chance to talk with you. And well, of course, we'll keep the conversation. And I certainly hope that even with all of these new realities of the pandemic, that we can meet and work on these issues again.
Great. I think digital meeting is always possible. I can also invite you and your students or whoever will watch our conversation to the wargaming seminars that are organized by Georgetown University. So over the course of next month, they have a couple of different speakers. And I will also speak more about my book on the 23rd of June. So if somebody was interested in some of the snippets I snuggled in, then you can definitely hear more there. It is of course digital and it is free, so everybody are welcomed. Join our conversation.
All right, thank you. I'll be sure to include a link to that and to your book on the video. So
Great.
thank you, Natalia.
Thank you very much for inviting and for the talk.
All right, thank you.